Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. I'm David Shaw, the Publishing Director of Directors and Boards magazine. I hope that you, your family members, and your fellow board members and employees are and remain in good health. What's a board to do when the company's climate lobbying is in opposition to the long-term risks of climate change to the company itself? Today's webinar is going to explore how robust climate change policies can serve as a risk mitigation tool for companies. We'll examine growing investor expectations for boards and management on corporate climate lobbying, and we'll identify governance systems that can better align all direct and indirect lobbying with climate science. But before we get started, some quick housekeeping details. If you've attended our webinars in the past, you know that right under the video screen, you can enter your questions and comments throughout the session. We'll get to as many of those as we can. We'll go for no more than 60 minutes today. And yes, the portion of the presentation that is on slides today will be emailed to you following the session. There are also 2 documents from Ceres that you were sent links to download. These are the Ceres Blueprint for Responsible Policy Engagement on Climate Change and Practicing Responsible Policy Engagement. So you can look for those during the webinar, or we will send you links afterwards as well. So joining me today is Emilia Miyazad. Emilia is founding director and senior research fellow, Business and Society Institute at Berkeley Law. She teaches several courses at the intersection of stakeholder capitalism and corporate governance, and has designed and teaches several executive education courses for C-suite executives and board members around the world. Emilia will be our moderator for today's discussion, and I turn this over to you now to take us away.
Okay, thank you so much, David. Thank you for the opportunity to focus on this very timely and very complicated issue. And thanks to the audience members for engaging with this topic. So, as David mentioned, we're going to talk about climate change risk and how corporate lobbying can help. Aligning corporate lobbying with climate change risk can help directors oversee that risk. Now, David mentioned risk to individual companies, and certainly when there's a disconnect between board oversight of climate change risk and a disconnect between lobbying activities, it hurts the individual firm. But as investors have realized, it's also a systemic risk, which means it hurts markets writ large, and it hurts the portfolios of large diversified investors in particular. So today we're going to address that moment, the moment that we're at. Investors have recognized that there's a disconnect, but we're also going to give you some governance frameworks and strategies developed by Ceres in a couple of recent reports on how to align your board oversight of climate change risk with your climate lobbying policies. We have 4 experts on this call, and the reason why, on this webinar, and the reason why there's 4 is because it's important to view this systemic issue from 4 different perspectives. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists for introductions. And if you can tell me, if you could briefly introduce yourself, but also weigh in a little bit about why you think that this is a crucial topic for boards today. And I will start with Anne.
Thanks so much, Emilia, and welcome to all of you. Really looking forward to this conversation. I have been at Ceres for about 16 years. I'm currently Vice President of Government Relations, and I love this topic. When I started at Ceres, I was actually running our corporate governance program. But I particularly like that we're discussing it today, because as we watch what's happening on Capitol Hill, nothing could be more relevant than seeking to make certain that companies' ambition and lobbying practices are perfectly aligned. And I'm looking forward to our back and forth. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Margaret.
Thanks, Emilia. Great to be here today. My name's Margaret Fleming. I'm an associate at Ceres focused on corporate governance and responsible policy engagement on lobbying, and really looking at the intersection of those two and how robust corporate governance systems can feed into aligned lobbying on climate change to address the systemic risk of climate change. And I've been with Ceres 3 years.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret. And I look forward to getting into the weeds on the reports with you. I know that you're instrumental in putting those reports together, and I've learned so much from you in our past conversations. So I'm particularly excited to delve in deeper. Adam.
Yeah, thanks, Emilia. Hi, I'm Adam Kanzer. I'm the head of stewardship for the Americas at BNP Paribas Asset Management. We are the asset management arm of the French bank with roughly $500 billion under management. Why is this an important topic for us? Why have we taken this on? Well, I mean, it's pretty simple. We have a really clear commitment to helping to fulfill the aims of the Paris Agreement. And we're just simply not going to get there without really strong and consistent private sector advocacy. And so when we look at companies in our portfolio that have strong positions on climate change, but they're members of trade associations that are simply pushing us in the opposite direction, that raises really significant concerns for us. And so we're finally looking to try to put a strong framework around that question. And I think the board has a really key role to play here. So I really particularly thank the board members that have joined us today for this conversation. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam. I echo that thanks. Celso.
Thank you, Emilia, and looking forward to the conversation today. Celso White, I'm actually a retired Global Chief Supply Chain Officer for Molson Coors, but positions I currently hold that are relevant to this topic today is I'm on the board of directors of CF Industries Holdings, one of the largest manufacturers of nitrogen fertilizer. So you can put the two together. And I'm also an advisor for Plan C Advisors, which advises boards on their climate strategies.
Okay, thank you. So as you can see, we have four very rich and very different perspectives on this topic. So let's go ahead and get started. And I'd like to start with the stakes with Anne. So before we dive into the blueprint and the benchmarking report with Margaret, which, as I mentioned, I'm excited to do, I'd like to contextualize why Ceres has decided to focus on this issue at this moment.
Yes, well, thanks, Emilia. And I think that Adam just really captured the essence of our work in this space as a key investor in our network. No question that he is much more fluent in talking about the nature of the investment risk, the systemic risk, also the reputational risk for companies to be saying one thing and doing another, the duplicity, the hypocrisy, particularly at a time when we see employees getting activated. I represent 75 major consumer brands that we take to Capitol Hill and to 17 state legislatures, and to have their own employees pushing back on them when they see dishonest behavior, there's no question about that being a risk. It's always a risk. But at this moment, at this critical once-in-a-generation moment, when we actually have the opportunity in Washington to pass meaningful climate legislation, it is particularly important. And I just can't believe how well you all managed to time this webinar. When we stand here today on the precipice of a historic House of Representatives vote on the bipartisan infrastructure package, to be followed most likely by a reconciliation package that is laden with cost-effective and vital climate provisions to help us address the climate crisis, and that really hold the only hope of holding our head up high in Glasgow at the global talks. We are looking at a particular bill that would essentially allow us to get close to meeting our interim target, our nationally determined contribution, which President Biden set at 52% reductions by 2030. And the only way we're going to do that is with some of the elements in this bill, including a clean electricity performance standard, including important investment tax credits for the renewable energy sector. It is an investment. And when you do an investment, I don't have to tell all of you, you have to invest. So yes, we are investing economically, and we are seeking to normalize the tax code to some extent, to equalize the tax code. And while Ceres isn't a tax specialist, I'm going to defer to Adam to talk about the wisdom of making the tax code more equitable. Why do I bring that up? To get to the heart of the matter. It is some of these tax provisions at this moment that have cut some of our corporate friends and allies from doing what they know they need to do, which is to step out and fully, robustly support the climate provisions of the budget reconciliation bill. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, as you'll hear from Margaret, one of the things our benchmark looked at was the degree to which companies hide behind major trade associations when they don't want to take a position. And the problem here is that the trade associations leap often to the lowest common denominator and do not properly represent the climate ambition of some of their members. And of course, you all have read these last 2 weeks about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable, just to mention a few, who have really put out very blanket oppositional statements that are not nuanced and don't take account of the climate leadership of their members, the climate ambition of their members. And as a result, the result is, in fact, potentially tragic. We could lose at this point, to answer your question about the stakes, we could lose both the bipartisan infrastructure package and the separate budget reconciliation package, which is laden with critical human infrastructure elements. But for this conversation, and the most popular elements of the package are the climate provisions. We could lose them both. Businesses have tremendous influence over lawmakers, and many businesses who have science-based targets, who have stated climate ambition, are being silent right now, and silence is not neutrality, or they are in fact in opposition right along with their trade association. So we're at a crucial moment for this conversation. And we want to do, as board members, and knowing your fiduciary duty the way you do, you want to be in a position where you can avoid this straight out hypocrisy. And many of our colleagues and many activist groups are calling out this hypocrisy, this duplicity, which is just unfortunate and unnecessary. We're thrilled with the number of companies that are an exception to this rule. We can share those today, those who've stood up and gotten behind the effort, gotten behind the package and the president in particular, or who have at least called out the cost effectiveness of the climate provisions of the bill. So this is really important for this particular fight. But let me say that this will be over. It's hard to believe, those of us who are living and breathing this particular controversy. This will end. And we will be getting ready for COP26. And there'll be many, many other important climate policies that come forward over the next 3 years of this administration. Methane regulations, vital climate disclosure regulations, all kinds of other areas where we will need responsible companies who have strong climate ambition to responsibly weigh in on their own and to make certain that their trade associations properly represent their ambition. Now, fortunately, Margaret is going to talk about a report, a blueprint that gives you the how-to on exactly how to do this. And it's going to be crucial, not only the next few weeks, but the next few years. And I'll look forward to questions from our colleagues.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Anne. So that was a really rich account of the investor demand, which we'll get into more, of course, with Adam, and the policy context and the juncture we are at with respect to what's at stake in public policy on this issue. I think that, from my perspective, I talk to a lot of board members. We have roundtables, and from my perspective, there's also a lack of clarity by board members as to how this relates to the board's fiduciary duties. And you touched upon it a bit when you discussed reputational risk, because if there's a disconnect, then consumers, employees, investors certainly will point to that disconnect between board strategy and climate lobbying, and show that and there's reputational risk there. Can you say more about how that's related to the board's duties and also the systemic risk piece? Because I know Ceres does so much work on dynamic and systemic risk, and I'd really love for the directors to have a crisp understanding of that.
Well, I mean, we could talk about this a long time ago. I'm so happy that you asked, because as I said at the beginning of my career at Ceres, I was really looking at the business judgment rule and the nature of a board member's fiduciary duty, and wondering about the emergence of novel legal theories that might come forward as we more abruptly face the true risks of climate change. And it raises a question of changes in the standard of care, changes in the legal precedents that will make individual board members specifically liable. And I think I'm really interested in how the law develops in that way. I think we have to kind of wait and see. What we do know is we're seeing much more in terms of attribution science and connecting particular greenhouse gas emissions and particular extreme weather events to the actions or inactions of individual corporate actors. I think that is being more fully developed, and that might affect liability. But again, I'm particularly interested in changes in the way in which we think about a standard of care for a board member. What is a current board member doing? Should one do in same or similar circumstances? I'm sure all of you are corporate secretaries and you've thought a lot about this, but I think that's where I would pay attention. If, as Adam alluded to, there is clearly we know about the cost of inaction, and we know about the financial risk associated with climate disaster and with continued climate change. So the rejection of a specific remedy that would have eliminated some of that long-term financial risk, the way that I would want to interpret that is potentially that could be a breach of one's standard of care as a fiduciary, as a board member. Now, you may think of that as a stretch, but just know that there are many law firms, a couple I've worked with, who are really looking at novel theories in this unprecedented crisis in which we find ourselves. It's hard to find a comparison in the law or to find a lot of case law in this area. But it seems to me that we're looking at a potential enormous long-term risk. And what are boards of directors supposed to do other than looking out for the long-term financial interests of the firm? I think that's where I would go. I might let Adam and Margaret talk a little bit more about the systemic risk. Much of our report is actually looking at systemic risk, and I don't want to take time away from Margaret.
Okay, thank you. So I'm gonna, thank you for that. And I don't think these series are novel at all. I think that given the investor demand, which we're going to turn to next, directors have to oversee financial risks, and climate change is a financial risk, and not having a link between your climate lobbying and your climate strategy. Investors are telling you it's a financial risk. So this is just, simple agency theory. Let's go to Adam, and I'd like to get the investor perspective because Anne alluded to it, but can we get some insights from you as to why are investors focused on this delta between public statements with respect to climate and climate lobbying activities?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So, and I think I'm going to pick up on a number of things that Anne said also on the nature of the risk. But first, I want to say, this is not a new topic. This has been an ongoing conversation with investors for many years, more than a decade, about the role of trade associations. And that conversation has covered over the years many different issues. I can recall a conversation with a company, back when the Affordable Care Act was proposed, and the company had a very strong position in favor of the Affordable Care Act, but was a member of the Chamber of Commerce, which was lobbying pretty hard against it. And it just didn't make any sense. You're financing both sides of the same issue. That's a waste of corporate assets. And on top, it's not a lot of assets, I understand in proportion, but the bigger issue there is that, if the piece of legislation, whatever it is we're talking about, has been acknowledged to be important and in the company's best long-term interests, then why would you also support efforts to undermine that? And the real risk is not reputational. I mean, that's always a risk, but the real risk is that the wrong side wins. That the trade association that's taking that lowest common denominator perspective wins. Then that's multiply that 1,000 times when we're talking about climate change. What you really have to look at, I think what boards really have to take a real hard look at, is the real physical risk of climate change. Now, that's not hard to do these last couple of years because we've all gotten a taste of what climate change looks like and feels like. With the raging fires, with the floods, and yes, also disease vectors will change with climate change. All of this is sort of tied together. It's affected every company because it's affected economies and it's affected consumers. It's only going to get worse. I read there's a study out there that says that at some stage, the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere simply makes it impossible for us to think straight. It affects brain function. And if you get to a point where you can't think straight, you certainly can't run your business. The the physical risks of climate change are the true risk that we're talking about. And we need to do whatever's necessary to avoid them. This is truly an existential risk, and it is unprecedented. There is no other risk that you have ever thought about in your role as a board member like climate change. This is it. So, I often feel like the guy on the street, with the sign saying the end of the world is nigh,
Yeah.
and that puts me in a very uncomfortable position. But in my role of stewardship, I kind of feel like that is my job. And I don't think I'm overstating the case here. The other piece is that it's important, the UN puts out a regular report on an emissions gap report, which talks about the gap between the ambition gap report that looks at the gap between the NDCs and what's actually needed, what the science
Right.
calls for. And there's a significant gap. And I think it's fair to say that companies have not always played a constructive role here, particularly trade associations and investors as well. I'm not going to exempt us from this, either. So we've had a lot of conversations about that and about the misaligned policies. And I will say the consistent message we get is, yes, you're right. We disagree with them on this, whatever that issue is. You can't agree on everything. So, we take this position, and that's not really why we're a member. We're a member of this organization for many, many, many other reasons. And climate is just one of those areas. And I get that, and that's fair. But I think at this stage, investors are saying that on climate, on this one, which is truly existential, we can no longer tolerate material misalignments. So that's where we are today, I think.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think that one thing that I wanted to focus on is, you said investors too. I'm not going to say that investors haven't been a part of this problem, but we see that changing. We see so much more investor focus and on accountability for board members for overseeing climate change risks. Can you talk about, just in the past couple of years, what has shifted and where do you see this momentum heading?
Yeah, and it's been dramatic actually, and really, really pleased to see. So let me just go over like the last couple of years. We worked with the Church of England and the Swedish pension fund AP7 back in 2018 to develop a set of investor expectations on corporate climate lobbying. Because the idea was, look, there have been these conversations for many, many years. We understand there's misalignments. Companies understand there's misalignments, but there's no structure around that. And investors haven't stated clear expectations. So we put that on paper, and it led to a lot of engagements with European companies that are part of the Climate Action 100 engagement, and some really groundbreaking reports from companies like BP and Shell talking about those misalignments. We then brought that to the US, working with Ceres and with Boston Trust Walden. In 2019, and we put together a letter on behalf of 200 investors managing more than $6.5 trillion. Now, I've been in this field for more than 20 years, and the trillions on these statements still astound me, and they're getting larger and larger and larger. And I will say $6.5 trillion, there's no way we could have gotten $6.5 trillion 10 years ago of investors. On top of that, we filed some shareholder proposals. I drafted this proposal asking the board to evaluate, whether or not your lobbying is aligned with the well below 2-degree goal of the Paris Agreement. How do you address those misalignments? And let's be transparent about it. Let's put a report out. And how shareholder proposals go on sustainability issues.
And Adam, sorry to interrupt you, but where was that proposal filed?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, we started with ExxonMobil, Chevron, Delta Airlines, and United Airlines in that first year. We first time out got a majority vote at Chevron, which I have to say was unexpected. And that tells me not that there was any genius in crafting this proposal, but that investors were ready for this. And investors, large mainstream investors, are saying, we recognize that public policy is a core component of any company's climate strategy, that we need strong board oversight, and we need it aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, not simply your own publicly stated positions, but the science. What does the science call for? Because we desperately need this and we need it now. This year, 5 more majority votes. So in just 2 years, this proposal has garnered 6 majority votes. And we're not just 51, 52%. A number of them are up there in the upper 60s. So, you know, there's going to be more of that. There's going to be more coming. But I think we're at a stage now where investors have spoken. It's very clear that this is needed. We have a set of expectations. We have this report from Ceres. There's a number of tools coming out. We're also working with a consultancy called Chronos Sustainability, which is about to put out a set of KPIs for, you know, what does good look like? What should these reports look like? What should be included in them? And we're hope that should be coming out very shortly. So I'm hoping that will be a good tool for boards to use.
Okay, thank you for that, Adam. And so just to build a bridge between the shareholder proposal and Margaret's, so that the presentation where we're going to get into the how, what did your proposal ask board members for?
Sure. So we asked the board to conduct an evaluation and issue a report on, you know, if and how the company's lobbying activities align with the goal of limiting average global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And it covers both direct lobbying and indirect lobbying through trade associations. And then should address the risks of, how do you address the risks of any misaligned lobbying that you identify? How do you mitigate those risks? We're not being prescriptive. We're not telling you got to leave trade associations. But we want to know what kind of process you have in place to engage with them. We'd actually, to be honest, I'd actually rather prefer that you stay in the trade association if you think that there's a possibility of shifting them, of moving their position. The key thing here, though, that I want to highlight, a few things. I really think there's a special role for the board to play here, because really the board, and particularly independent directors, are the only group that stands in a position to access the information needed to conduct this analysis. So we're looking for, I'm not saying the board has to do all the work here, but we're looking for a board-led process and a meaningful analysis that really looks at your direct lobbying, your indirect lobbying, measure it against the goals of the Paris Agreement, and draw some judgment about that. We're not, you know, in the past, I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think largely the lobbying oversight was receiving reports on dues paid and maybe asking some questions, but I don't know how much more it went than that because it's largely opaque to us. I also want to point out one more development. You probably followed the Greenpeace unearthed sort of undercover sting operation on Exxon. They got a couple of Exxon lobbyists to go on camera thinking that they were interviewing for a job and said a number of things about Exxon's direct lobbying on climate that was in contradiction with the company's stated positions. Now, we just got a majority vote at Exxon on our proposal. This happened a couple of months later. Now, let me take a step back. In the statement in opposition that the board signed off on, the board said that Exxon's direct lobbying, without exception, was fully aligned with its publicly stated positions.
Okay.
Well, this investigation suggests that might not be true. And so the question to the board members here is your board prepared to make that statement? And if so, what would be the basis of that statement? Have you conducted an evaluation? Do you really understand what your lobbyists are out there saying and what your trade associations are out there saying? Have you done the work to do that?
Okay, thank you for that. So, and I look forward to bringing Celso to the conversation, getting the board members' perspective. But before I do that, I want to go into the how with Margaret. So now that we have a clear idea of the problem, can you walk us through the recent benchmark and just give us an overview of its key findings, which I found really powerful. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Emilia. Absolutely. And thanks to Adam and Anne for laying out the problem so clearly. So to set the context here a bit, the Blueprint for Responsible Policy Engagement that David mentioned at the beginning was released in July 2020. And it was developed in an effort to provide additional guidance to companies looking to meet those investor expectations that Adam laid out. So this report provides recommendations on the systems and processes that companies can put in place to really break down those internal silos and ensure that the company is taking a coordinated approach to addressing climate change and matching this with what the science calls for in order to tackle the risks that climate change poses to companies, industries, and as Emilia mentioned and others, the financial markets writ large, so that systemic risk piece. So fast forwarding to this past summer, we released the Practicing Responsible Policy Engagement Assessment. And this analyzes the extent to which the S&P 100 companies are putting these recommendations into practice. So the online tool includes trends, leading practices, and a database rating the S&P 100's performance on different areas of climate policy engagement, including corporate governance systems. And I believe there's a few slides that feature some of the key takeaways here. But looking into what we found in the trends this year, the first interesting piece is that a growing number of companies...
Are the slides up? I just want to make sure that the audience can see the slides.
The slides are up, yes.
They are, okay, thank you.
Great. So as I mentioned, a growing number of companies, we found 88%, in fact, are formally charging their boards with the responsibility to oversee sustainability or climate change at the committee level. And another 74% acknowledge that climate change poses a material risk to their enterprises. However, the interesting piece here is that for about half the companies, there still appears to be a disconnect with the role that policy plays. We saw that 51% of the assessed companies described policies or legislation to address climate change solely as a short-term financial risk. So this seems to indicate that many companies remain primarily focused on the near-term costs associated with climate policy action and less so on the significant costs associated with unabated climate change in the long run. And as Anne mentioned, this is where we really need boards to focus and looking to protect the long-term value of the company and in doing that assessment of what their company is going to look like in a world where climate change is continuing to run rampant. So in terms of the second key finding, along this similar thread, the study found that while 92% of the S&P 100 companies have committed to reducing their own emissions, only 40% are actively engaging with lawmakers on policies that could help them meet these goals. And the last point to highlight here would be in regards to trade association activity. Specifically, we looked at the Chamber of Commerce because it is one of the largest and most influential trade associations in the world, and it also has a long track record of playing an obstructionist role on science-based climate policies. And as Anne detailed earlier, we're seeing this opposition right now in the way that Chamber has launched a major campaign to block the reconciliation package. Again, as I mentioned, that includes robust climate policies that will help our nation and our states and companies of all sizes meet the challenge of climate change head on. So while nearly 3/4 of the S&P 100 companies are members of the Chamber, many of them climate champions themselves, we're seeing that they're too rarely speaking out to acknowledge these conflicts. Just 9% have acknowledged the Chamber's oppositional climate change record, and even fewer are publicly disclosing that they've engaged the Chamber in hopes of changing its position. So I'll stop there. Emilia, you might be on mute from my end, at least.
Sorry. Thank you for that. I was saying that data was sobering, actually. But you have developed a series of recommendations for companies and for boards in particular. Can you give us a high-level overview of those recommendations?
Absolutely. So at the board level, the blueprint recommends that companies oversee climate change as a part of their oversight of corporate risk, strategy, and resilient performance. And those companies whose boards have an explicit mandate to oversee both climate change and lobbying are best positioned to consider these and the overlap between them regularly and robustly. And where these responsibilities are in separate committees, the committees should work together to allow for the necessary integrated deliberations. And I think another factor is just making sure that boards are asking management the right questions. When you think about the internal silos at the management level, really relying on board members to really start posing those questions and driving that more integrated deliberation of the company's climate strategy. So when we look at the management level, as I mentioned, it's really breaking down those silos between different teams and making sure that there's a coordinated approach going forward. So and across organizational group that includes government affairs, legal counsel, risk management teams, investor relations, and the sustainability team will really be best positioned to discuss the company's position on evolving regulatory and policy landscape and ensure that those decisions are aligned with climate science. And this group can really be the group that's able to present those updates and details and keep the board informed so that they're able to respond to these investor questions and requests that are coming to them. Mm-hmm. Lastly, Adam summarized it already, but something that we're seeing coming from investors is this request to conduct what many call a climate policy audit, and evaluating the extent to which their direct lobbying and the lobbying of their trade associations is aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So some details from that, and this is referenced more in the blueprint and a number of resources that investors are pulling together and other organizations focused on this topic. But it really involves a few step-by-step items that are focused on first transparency and then action. So investors are really just looking, as Adam said, to understand, are you doing these types of assessments internally? Are you aware of your trade associations who lobby on climate policy? And are you aware of the positions they're taking? Have you done that sort of analysis? And so that involves providing a clear framework of the factors that the company is using to assess this trade association, as well as disclosing the results of the assessment, and then disclosing the actions that are taken to address those misalignments and setting the red line, as one of our investor colleagues referenced in an earlier webinar, of what's too far for the company in terms of what positions the trade association is taking, and putting some deadlines to that as well when looking for the trade association to take action.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that overview and for the tremendous work in both the blueprint and the report. I wanted to get Celso's opinion as a board member because, that is the majority of our audience right now, and it can be challenging, particularly, Margaret flagged something very crucial, which is just a lack of visibility. Right, a lack of information as to what's happening at the management and the operational level. So, as a director, how do you view your role in overseeing climate lobbying?
Yes, thank you, Emilia and Margaret and Adam for providing a great context leading to this aspect of it. Let me just provide a bit of context, especially as a board. As I serve on the board of CF Industries, given that, as we all know, this is all publicly disclosed, we're one of the major contributors of greenhouse gases in the chemical sector. But as you all also know, we invest tremendous amount of talent and capital in mitigating and reducing this. We've embraced one of the key outcomes of the Paris Agreement, which is net zero by 2050. And based on that, in late 2020, we evolved our vision, mission, and strategies in order to step change our efforts in order to get ourselves there, obviously. And the vision is now to become a global leader in providing clean energy for a better world. And so you can see this is pretty ambitious, but at the same time, our mission and strategies have evolved to address that vision, okay? Leveraging, especially in our strategy, our core capabilities of producing ammonia that could be used for transport of hydrogen, which then it would be able to expand clean fuels, capabilities of basically capturing carbon and sequestering the carbon, that we can help other companies do that, given that we do that today, and also using ammonia as a fuel, especially in large operations like marine operations, etc., which we have a few partners as we develop these and invest tremendous amount of capital and talent into getting ourselves there. And how we plan to get there is by going from what we consider gray ammonia, which is the current state, to blue ammonia, which is a lot less carbon emissions, to green ammonia. By just, we're working towards that target of before 2050 because it has to be expanded throughout the entire operations. Okay, so just based on this, we've also added an environmental sustainability and community committee to the board. This is an additional committee that we added to the board, and the purpose of this committee is really to help us all assess and fulfill our oversight responsibilities with respect to our strategy, goals, objectives, practices, and policies. Okay, so with that background, I would say, we definitely, from a board standpoint, embrace policies that align with our vision, mission, and strategies. And I'm very specific on this because I always try to be very transparent, and none of this has not been disclosed. We will consider lobbying for policies, and the key word is consider lobbying for policies that align with our vision, mission, and strategies. Okay, and as you can see, those are pretty ambitious because it's we want to be a global leader in providing clean energy for a better world. Okay, leveraging our capabilities in ammonia.
Okay, thank you. So this is really interesting because you are getting far more sophisticated than many companies with respect to having the board oversee a strategy that is aligned with your climate goals. You have an independent committee on the board that's relatively new. But what kind of information does your board get about the lobbying that the company currently does? How often is that discussed? How does the board weigh in on that to ensure that there isn't this, this gap that Adam is certainly concerned with, and I'm sure your investors are as well.
Yeah, we're kept appraised in like every other committee in every single board meeting. And if there are new, I would say, specific either policies or lobbying efforts that we should undertake based on our climate goals, those are, we might call a meeting in order to review those and either align or agree or disagree and provide some oversight to the management team, how we should move with respect to that specific. And remember, this was end of 2020 since we've put this together. So obviously we've had now 3 board meetings and where they're keeping us very much appraised of how we're progressing, going to a 4th one now in October. So it's fairly new for us. So we're learning as we go. And I'm just, being honest and transparent. But I can tell you we're very much committed, given that it clearly would have an impact on our long-term profitability and sustainability if we don't continue to address this and meet our objectives as we've set them with our new strategy.
Okay, thank you so much, and I'm deeply grateful for your transparency and of course so many companies, so many directors are at the beginning of this journey, and thank you for talking to us about the direct lobbying. How about the indirect lobbying through the trade associations, which is something that I frankly hadn't appreciated until I delved into the reports by Ceres. What's the board strategy with respect to trade associations?
What we like to better understand when it comes to trade associations, and this is the oversight and direction we provide. It becomes a bit of a gray area because, again, who are the competitors or who is part of that association? Obviously, we need to understand that and be comfortable with that aspect of it. Are our competitors part of that? How much transparency is there within those members that are in the direct trade association in their reporting of the operation and the lobbying efforts, in their lobbying goals and objectives? Because we just want to ensure that we're all very much aligned so that it becomes a win-win for everyone involved and we avoid those surprises. So we're still evaluating that aspect, well, at least management is, before we jump in, head first in that aspect of it. And that's one of the big, I would say, gray areas and perhaps even a tension that we're experiencing as we speak.
Okay, thank you. That's such an important point about not wanting to be at a competitive disadvantage. I mean, just a business reality. Sometimes I hear directors say, "Well, we don't want to be at a competitive disadvantage with our peers in this area." So again, thank you for your your engagement and your transparency on this. So let's go to bringing in Margaret and Adam and Anne into the discussion. Back into the discussion. I wanted to start with a discussion with Tim and Adam on what Margaret presented and like what we're hearing a little bit of is a disconnect between directors and investors on communication. And how do you think that we can facilitate that communication in a more productive way?
I was on mute. What do you know? Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think the main problem there is that investors and directors don't talk to each other enough. And so we need to do more.
Also thinks you guys talk a lot, right?
Well, I would say not enough, and there are some companies where it's never. It's almost like a policy that they don't let anybody talk to their directors. So we need more. I think we need more communication. I want to pick up on one point that Margaret made that I think is just really interesting. That she said that more than 50% describe climate policy as a short-term risk. And Margaret analyzed that, and I agree with her analysis. I just want to point out another way of looking at it, which is that it suggests to me that companies are still seeing regulation, including climate regulation, as a threat. That it's external to the company's climate strategy, and that sort of implies that each company can handle the threat of climate all on its own.
Yes.
We've got our operational emissions under control, or we've got our plan for bringing our operational emissions under control. We're good. We don't need government. Well, we do. We need government. We all need government. It's systemic risk. When you have a systemic risk, that's the role of government. So companies really need to see public policy as a pillar of your climate strategy. And when you discuss your climate strategy, you should discuss your public policy strategy as well alongside of it. So when we approach companies about climate lobbying and trade associations, there is often a tendency for the company to want to take the conversation back to its own greenhouse gas reduction commitments and not talk about public policy. We're trying to kind of break down that barrier, because you can't get there without government. You can't get there without the right policies. That doesn't answer the question about, well, which policies do we need? But,
Right.
But public policy is a critical piece of it, and we just don't talk about it enough. And companies are not transparent enough about the positions they take. Corporate lobbying, for the most part, is pretty opaque. We don't get a lot of information. And, for some companies that are doing good reporting, primarily what they're doing is they're telling us the organizations they belong to and the dues they pay, which is good. We need that information. But they don't take a step further and say, and we supported this bill and we opposed this one, and here's why. And here's our strategy. Here's what we think the government needs to do to get us to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. These are the kinds of things we support. Often when you do see statements like that, it's so sort of riddled with gray areas that it's impossible to really evaluate what's intended. So I'd love to increase that conversation. And I'd love to also understand to what extent the directors really feel like they have a good grasp of the public policy sphere in terms of climate. Do they understand what's needed? Do they understand what will work and what won't work? Do they have their own position on what are good, what they think would make sense, or are they largely being educated by management on that? Because obviously directors have a wide range of experiences and a wide range of expertise, and this may not be one of them. It's not a criticism. It's just, does the board have that have that understanding. It can get very technical and really complex.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anne, did you want to weigh in on that? And then I know that we have, David tells me we have more questions than we can get to. So I think I'll have Anne weigh in on Adam's point, and then we'll turn to the audience.
Well, I very much want to get to the audience questions, but I want to underscore something. Adam's last comment, I think, is really important. Do directors have the background they need to be fluent on commenting on climate policy, or are they relying on potentially a little bit of a biased view from management? Let me just say, we'd be thrilled to train directors on the nuances of current climate policy at the state and federal level. I think it's crucially important that directors have an independent view and an independent voice.
Yeah, that is a crucial point, and it's also part of their duties to be independent. They're independent directors, right? And so we need to make sure that the conduits of information are not just coming from management, but that are coming from external experts, policymakers, and policy advisors. So let's jump to the audience questions. David, how did you want to handle those?
I'll bring them in at this point. So nice to join you all. We just have about 10 minutes left. This question might be for Celso, but also for Adam and everyone, which is, which committees are you seeing? If you don't have a sustainability committee, which committees are overseeing lobbying within the board, or is that a full board experience?
Well, I can start off by that one, because prior to having, the sustainability committee, the governance committee did most of that overseeing, and that there's plus and minuses to that. It just did not bring the level of focus that was required, at least for CF, given that, the big ambitious goals we've undertaken. The goals that we're undertaking are so ambitious and reachable, by the way. It's just taking a whole lot of investment. But that required, a separate committee so that we can truly build, this muscle within the organization and meet our commitments. To the point that Adam was making, I think Anne also made, we get to the point where we only know what we don't know what we don't know. So this committee, as I mentioned, one of the goals is on policies. It's helping us understand, what else do we need to do and undertake as fast as they possibly can in order to get ourselves there, at least from a board standpoint, because it's a big board education taking place as we speak.
Thank you so much. That we don't know what we don't know is such a crucial point. David, should we go to the next audience question?
Certainly. This one is actually, I think, directed at Adam, because it's you had these proposals, these proxy proposals that passed by a majority. What happened? What have you received?
Sure. Well, last year, Chevron produced a report in response to the proposal, and we're still, we're continuing to engage with Chevron. It's not a perfect report, but it's a good, it's a good first start. And I think that, Chevron's been very open with us about, the desire to improve with successive reports and to take our feedback. So it's been actually a really constructive, really good ongoing dialogue. With Exxon and Delta, their boards have yet to meet, I think, or they're meeting this month in follow-up to the annual meetings. So our assumption is that they're going to comply with the proposal and produce the report. But, technically, the board has to make that decision, and the board hadn't met yet. So we're looking forward to having a conversation with them as soon as that board meeting is complete. And we've provided all sorts of resources for how to do a good analysis. We filed, so of those 6 majority votes, we did 3 of them, and other investors were responsible for the other 3. There's also been a whole series of dialogues, and without the need for a proposal, where companies have agreed to do the reports. So there's a lot of movement in this area, and we're getting to a point where we can start comparing these reports, and we can start sort of picking and choosing and saying, hey, this is a good element here, and this is a good element here, and this is part of what this Kronos project I mentioned before is about. What does a really good report look like? What are we aiming for? Because this is all pretty experimental. The first reports only came out a few years ago, and the companies kind of made up their own framework. So we're through a process of experimentation, hopefully we're going to get to something that's a little bit more systematic and comparable.
At what point do you exercise your power as an owner of these companies and not own them anymore?
That's a whole other really complicated question.
That's next month's webinar.
Yeah, that is a whole other webinar, and we do that from time to time. We do have companies that we exclude from at least from our actively managed portfolios for a whole range of sustainability issues. Generally, pretty egregious conduct. Pretty severe human rights violations or severe environmental violations. I will say that we have started to vote against directors at globally at companies where we feel that they have not taken sufficient action on climate, where their disclosures are inadequate, and we're adding in inadequate response on climate lobbying. Now, that's a difficult one to assess because there's just not a lot of data out there. We do lean on Influence Map quite a bit to understand. They do some good analyses, but honestly, as I said before, I think really only the independent directors stand in a position to do a full analysis, a full objective analysis, because you're going to have access to all sorts of internal proprietary stuff that you're not going to put in the report, but you can use to, contribute to your analysis. We can't get that. All we can get is whatever's out there in the public sphere, plus whatever management told us. So that's why we're calling upon the board to do this. And we understand that, in this day and age, board directors have 1,000 responsibilities, and it seems like every year there's like 5 more added on. And I guess I'll sort of apologize for that. But on the other hand, this is, as I said before, an existential risk, and you're kind of the only people that can do this for us.
Okay. Well, this question, let's put this one over to Celso, because you've done some interesting work at CF Industries. What do you think it will take to shift the mindset at the board level when it comes to climate change as a risk? Because that seems to be an area that some directors are struggling with in the boardroom, that it is either seen as a risk or it's seen as something down the road.
Yeah, and again, that depends on the company. Some are easier than others. I've held C-level positions at Molson Coors, and obviously there's a risk there because of water and also greenhouse gases, given the amount of distribution that we had in place. And so that's important, but is it really existential other than water? And water is key, so that becomes a big thing. But now with CF, because of what the amount of greenhouse gases that we emit and what it takes to reduce that, it becomes a lot more existential. Why? Because of reputation. Okay, so that the reputation to the company, and not only that, but climate has proven to impact some of our biggest operations, throughout the world. It's just not a good thing as we continue to have these tropical storms, hurricanes, and where we're located. Perhaps Donaldsonville, Louisiana, just got hit with this last one, and it becomes a very, very challenging proposition for us if we do not act. So we don't really have much of a choice there. But again, like I said, I work for Molson Coors, not much of a choice when it comes to water. For Pepsi, where I held positions of VP and general manager, we did not have much of a choice there. So we work on certain things that, if you do not address, would be existential for the company in the long run.
Okay. Well, we are coming up to time here. Emilia, 20 seconds for closing.
Okay, 20 seconds for closing. So I hope that everybody in this audience will read the terrific reports that Ceres has prepared. And I hope that as board members, you will begin the conversation with management and your investors on how your company's climate lobbying aligns with your ambitious climate goals. The goals are exciting. I know that many directors believe that, rightfully so, that your long-term sustainability and even short-term sustainability with climate disasters depends on getting to those goals. But regulation and public policy is a key aspect of that. And as Anne alliterated, this is an exciting moment for progress on public policy. So I hope that board members will initiate those conversations with management and investors and trade associations. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and engage on this timely and crucial issue.
Well, thank you. And you did a tremendous job of guiding this conversation forward. So I just want to say how much I appreciate that. So with that, I wish everyone a great rest of your day. This was a terrific panel. I appreciate this panel's commitment to this. I look forward to us having some more in-depth discussions like this in the future. I'm going to end the webcast now, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you very much.